"You're still the same pathetic failure you've always been, Jessica," my cousin Amanda sneered at the family reunion, her designer dress catching the afternoon light. 3 hours later, when my driver pulled up in the Rolls Royce to collect me, the entire Miller family reunion went dead silent. I made sure they all saw exactly who they had been mocking. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of the Miller family reunion started like any other, Saturday, in my small Lincoln Park apartment. Sunlight streamed through the single window of my studio, illuminating the organized chaos that had become my workspace. My laptop sat open on the kitchen table, surrounded by client files and half-empty coffee cups that told the story of another late night spent perfecting digital strategies for the small businesses I served. I was Jessica Marie Miller, though most of my extended family would struggle to tell you what I actually did for work. At 32, I had carved out a living as a freelance digital consultant, helping mom and pop shops navigate the confusing world of online marketing and customer management systems. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly didn't come with the prestige that the Miller family valued, but it paid my bills and gave me a sense of purpose that I'd never found in traditional employment. The Miller family reunion happened every 3 years like clockwork, rotating between different venues, but always maintaining the same suffocating atmosphere of competitive achievement and barely concealed judgment. This year's gathering was scheduled at Oakwood Country Club in the affluent suburb of Lake Forest, about an hour north of Chicago. The venue choice alone sent a message about expectations and social positioning that I'd learned to decode over decades of family gatherings. Growing up as the daughter of Robert and Linda Miller had been comfortable but unremarkable. Dad worked as a mid-level insurance adjuster for State Farm, methodically processing claims and building a steady, if unspectacular, career over 30 years. Mom taught 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary, pouring her heart into shaping young minds while earning a teacher's modest salary. They were good, hardworking people who had provided me with stability, love, and middle-class opportunities. But their version of success didn't translate into the kind of achievements that impressed our extended family. The Miller clan was one of those sprawling Midwestern families where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, and success was measured in easily quantifiable metrics. Medical degrees, law partnerships, suburban mansions, luxury vehicles, and the number of zeros in your annual income. My Uncle Mike had built a successful plumbing supply business that employed 40 people across 3 states. Aunt Carol had married a cardiologist and lived in a 6-bedroom house in Winnetka. Cousin Brian was a partner at a prestigious law firm downtown, while his sister Sarah had completed her residency in pediatrics and was building a thriving practice. Then there was Amanda Miller Hensley, the undisputed golden child of our generation. Amanda had followed the prescribed path to perfection, valedictorian at New Trier Township High School, summa cum laude from Northwestern University, law degree from University of Chicago, immediate hiring at Miller & Associates, one of Chicago's most established corporate law firms. She'd married another lawyer, bought a sprawling house in Hinsdale, produced 2 beautiful children exactly 2 years apart, and seemed to glide through life accumulating achievements like merit badges. I had taken a different path entirely, though not necessarily by choice initially. College had been a struggle, not academically, but emotionally. The pressure to declare a major that would lead to a prestigious career had left me paralyzed with anxiety. I'd started in pre-med, switched to business, tried communications, and finally graduated with a degree in English literature after 6 years and 3 school changes. My parents had been supportive but worried, especially when I moved back home. After graduation and spent 8 months working at a local bookstore while trying to figure out my next steps, the transition into digital consulting had happened almost by accident. Mrs. Patterson, who owned the flower shop next to the bookstore, had been struggling with her new point-of-sale system and asked if I could help her figure out how to track inventory and customer information. One thing led to another, and soon I was helping her set up a basic website and social media presence. Within 6 months, her business had increased by 40%, and she was referring other small business owners to me. What had started as favor for a neighbor gradually evolved into a steady stream of clients who needed help navigating the digital transformation that was reshaping how businesses operated. I discovered that I had an intuitive understanding of technology systems and, more importantly, the ability to translate complex digital concepts into practical solutions that busy business owners could actually implement. Unlike the large consulting firms that charged thousands of dollars for elaborate reports that gathered dust on shelves, I focused on creating simple, actionable strategies that produced measurable results. My approach was hands-on and personal. I would spend time in each business, observing workflows, talking to employees, understanding the unique challenges and opportunities that each client faced. A family-owned restaurant needed a better system for managing online orders and delivery coordination. A boutique clothing store wanted to expand their customer base through social media marketing. A local accounting firm struggled with client communication and file management. Each business had different needs, but they all shared common problems: limited budgets, minimal technical expertise, and the overwhelming complexity of modern digital marketing. Working with small businesses taught me things that no MBA program could have provided. I learned about cash flow management from business owners who had to make payroll every 2 weeks, regardless of whether their biggest client had paid their invoice. I understood customer service from shop owners who knew their regular customers by name and remembered their preferences. I discovered the importance of community relationships from entrepreneurs who built their success on word-of-mouth referrals, and local partnerships. The work was fulfilling in ways I hadn't anticipated. When I helped Rosa's Bakery increase their catering orders by 300%, I wasn't just improving their profit margins. I was helping Rosa hire her nephew and provide health insurance for her employees. When I streamlined the appointment scheduling system for Dr. Patel's family practice, I wasn't just optimizing efficiency, I was reducing wait times for patients and decreasing stress for the office staff. My income had grown steadily over 3 years of building my consulting practice. I wasn't getting rich, but I was earning enough to live comfortably in the city, save money for the future, and even take occasional vacations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. More importantly, I was building expertise in an area where I felt genuinely competent and valued. My clients trusted my judgment, implemented my recommendations, and saw real improvements in their businesses as a result of our work together. But none of this translated into the kind of success that my extended family recognized or respected. I didn't have letters after my name. I didn't work for a prestigious company, and I couldn't point to a specific title or salary that would impress anyone at a cocktail party. When relatives asked what I did for work, their eyes would glaze over. When I explained digital consulting for small businesses, it sounded vague and unimportant, like something people did when they couldn't get a real job in their field. The pressure to conform to family expectations had intensified as I'd gotten older. Every Christmas gathering, every birthday celebration, every chance encounter with relatives became an opportunity for gentle interrogation about my life choices. When was I going to get a stable job with benefits? Why wasn't I married yet? Shouldn't someone my age have bought a house by now? The questions always came wrapped in concern and affection, but the underlying message was clear. I was falling behind, failing to meet the basic benchmarks of adult success. Preparing for the reunion that morning, I had tried on 3 different outfits before settling on a simple black dress that struck a balance between professional and approachable. I couldn't compete with Amanda's designer wardrobe or Sarah's elegant maternity wear, but I could at least look put together and confident. My jewelry was minimal but quality, my shoes were comfortable but stylish, and my handbag was large enough to carry business cards in case anyone showed genuine interest in my work. The drive to Lake Forest gave me time to mentally prepare for the inevitable conversations about my life and career. I practiced explaining my consulting work in terms that would sound more impressive, emphasizing the strategic planning and business development aspects rather than the technical implementation details. I rehearsed responses to the usual questions about marriage and home ownership, trying to frame my choices as deliberate rather than circumstantial. Oakwood Country Club sat on beautifully manicured grounds that showcased the kind of understated elegance that old money preferred. The building itself was classic Georgian architecture, all red brick and white columns, surrounded by rolling lawns and mature oak trees that provided shade for the golf course stretching into the distance. Expensive cars filled the parking lot: Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, and the occasional Porsche or Tesla that announced their owner's success without being too flashy about it. Walking through the main entrance, I was greeted by the familiar sense of fresh flowers and expensive furniture, polish that seemed to permeate every upscale venue I'd ever visited. The Miller family had reserved the club's main banquet room, a spacious area with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the 18th green. Round tables covered in white linens were scattered throughout the room, each decorated with centerpieces of seasonal flowers that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. The reunion was already in full swing when I arrived, fashionably late, but not rudely so. Clusters of relatives stood around the room, catching up on family news and sharing updates about their lives and careers. Children ran between the adult conversations, their laughter adding energy to the otherwise formal atmosphere. A bar had been set up in one corner, staffed by professional bartenders who were efficiently serving wine, cocktails, and soft drinks to guests who clearly felt comfortable in this kind of environment. I spotted my parents immediately, standing near the registration table where name tags and family directory updates were being distributed. Mom looked elegant in a navy dress that she'd probably bought specifically for this occasion, while Dad wore his best suit with the tie that Mom had given him for Christmas 2 years ago. They were talking with Uncle Mike and Aunt Carol, the conversation animated but polite in the way that family discussions often were when everyone was trying to make a good impression. "Jessica," Mom called out when she saw me approaching, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "You look beautiful, honey. I'm so glad you could make it." The warmth in her voice reminded me why I loved my parents despite our different perspectives on success and life choices. They had never made me feel like a disappointment, even when I knew they worried about my unconventional path and uncertain future. "Hi, Mom, Dad." I hugged them both, drawing comfort from their familiar presence in this room full of people who would be judging every aspect of my appearance and accomplishments. "The club looks beautiful. Very impressive venue choice." Uncle Mike turned, his attention to me with the booming voice that had made him successful in business and insufferable at family gatherings. "Jess, there's our computer expert, still helping people with their websites and all that technical stuff?" His tone was friendly but dismissive, the way adults talk to children about their hobbies rather than their serious pursuits. I had learned over the years that Uncle Mike wasn't intentionally condescending. He simply couldn't conceive of work that didn't involve physical products or face-to-face services as being particularly important or challenging. "I'm doing digital consulting for small businesses," I replied, keeping my voice pleasant while internally cringing at how vague and unimpressive that sounded in this context. "Helping them optimize their operations and grow their customer base through better technology integration." Aunt Carol smiled politely, the kind of expression that indicated she was listening but not really understanding or caring about the details. "That sounds very modern and interesting, dear. Are you working for a company or doing it on your own?" The question contained multiple layers of judgment disguised as innocent curiosity. Working for a company would imply stability, benefits, and legitimacy. Working on my own suggested either entrepreneurial ambition or inability to secure proper employment, and she was clearly trying to determine which interpretation applied to my situation. "I have my own consulting practice," I said, trying to inject confidence into my voice. I work with about 20 regular clients and help them solve problems related to digital marketing, customer management, and operational efficiency. Oh, how entrepreneurial, Aunt Carol exclaimed, but her tone suggested that entrepreneurship was something people did when they couldn't get hired elsewhere rather than a legitimate career choice. That must be very exciting, all that uncertainty and variability. Before I could respond, my cousin Brian approached our little group with his wife Jennifer, who was 7 months pregnant with their third child. Brian had inherited Uncle Mike's commanding presence, but with additional polish that came from his legal education and professional success. He wore his achievements casually, but visibly, from his perfectly tailored suit to his expensive watch, to the confident way he moved through social situations. "Jessica, good to see you," Brian said, extending his hand for a firm handshake that felt more professional than familial. "Jennifer and I were just talking about you. Mom mentioned you're still doing that freelance computer work." The phrase "still doing" carried particular weight, implying that my consulting practice was a phase I should have outgrown rather than a career I was actively building. It was the same tone people used when asking if someone was still waiting tables or still living with roommates, activities that were acceptable temporarily but concerning if they continued too long. "Digital consulting has been going really well," I replied, determined to frame my work positively despite their apparent skepticism. "I've been able to help a lot of small businesses improve their efficiency and increase their revenue significantly." Jennifer smiled sweetly, her hand resting on her rounded belly in the universal pose of pregnant women who were comfortable displaying their fertility as a mark of life success. "That's so nice that you're helping small businesses. It must be very rewarding work, even if it's not particularly lucrative." The casual assumption that my work wasn't financially successful stung, especially because it revealed how my family perceived my lifestyle and choices. They saw my modest apartment, my reliable but unremarkable car, my simple clothing and accessories, and concluded that I must be struggling financially rather than choosing to live below my means while building my business. "Actually, the consulting has been quite profitable," I said, perhaps more defensively than I intended. "Small business owners are willing to pay well for expertise that helps them solve real problems and grow their companies." Brian nodded. Politely, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. As someone who billed $300 an hour for corporate legal work, he probably couldn't imagine that helping small businesses could generate serious income. In his world, prestigious clients paid prestigious fees, and everything else was essentially charity work or hobby activity. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Amanda Miller Hensley, who swept into our circle with the kind of confidence that came from never doubting your place in any social hierarchy. Amanda looked stunning, as she always did, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent and jewelry that caught the light with every gesture. Her blonde hair was styled in the kind of effortless-looking waves that required hours of professional attention, and her makeup was flawless in the way that suggested regular visits to high-end salons. "Family meeting?" she announced with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I've been circulating around the room, but I had to come over and catch up with everyone in the core family group. Amanda had a way of positioning herself as the natural leader of our generation, the cousin who had achieved the most and therefore deserved the most attention and deference from everyone else. It wasn't entirely unfair, given her impressive list of accomplishments, but it created a dynamic where every conversation became an implicit comparison with her success. "Amanda, you look absolutely gorgeous," Mom said with genuine admiration. "That dress is stunning on you." "Thank you, Aunt Linda. It's Armani from their new fall collection. I picked it up when David and I were in New York last month for the American Bar Association conference." Amanda's response managed to acknowledge the compliment while also working in references to expensive designer labels, luxury travel, and professional recognition. She turned her attention to me with the kind of smile that wealthy people gave to service workers, friendly but clearly establishing hierarchy. "Jessica, it's been too long. You look like you're doing well, still living in That cute little apartment in Lincoln Park? The word cute was perfectly chosen to be simultaneously complimentary and diminishing. My apartment was cute the way a child's artwork was cute, charming in its simplicity, but not something that serious adults would choose if they had better options available. I love living in the city, I replied, trying to focus on the positive aspects of my housing choice rather than its limitations compared to Amanda's suburban mansion. Lincoln Park is a great neighborhood, very convenient for work and social activities. Oh, that's right. You're still doing the computer consulting thing, Amanda said, her tone suggesting that she'd forgotten this detail until just now, though I was certain she remembered every aspect of my life that she could use for comparison purposes. How's that working out for you? Found any big clients yet, or still mostly small local businesses? The question contained several assumptions that revealed Amanda's perspective on my work. First, that big clients were inherently more valuable or impressive than small ones. Second, that my current client base was somehow insufficient or temporary. Third, that I should be aspiring to work with different types of companies rather than being satisfied with my current focus. I specialize in small and medium-sized businesses, I said, trying to frame this as a strategic choice rather than a limitation. There's a huge need for affordable, practical digital consulting in that market segment. Most large consulting firms don't want to work with smaller companies because the contracts aren't big enough, so there's an opportunity to provide real value to businesses that are often overlooked. Amanda nodded thoughtfully, but I could see her processing this information in terms of what it revealed about my professional limitations rather than my strategic positioning. In her world, specializing in smaller clients meant you couldn't compete for larger ones, just as living in a studio apartment meant you couldn't afford a house. That makes sense, she said in the tone people used when they were being polite about something they didn't really understand or respect. It's nice that you're helping local businesses. Very community-minded of you. The phrase community-minded was another perfectly calibrated put-down, suggesting that my work was motivated by altruism rather than professional ambition, charity rather than business success. It positioned me as someone who helped others out of kindness, rather than someone who had built a profitable enterprise based on valuable expertise. Before I could formulate a response that would correct this mischaracterization without sounding defensive, the conversation was interrupted by an announcement that lunch was being served. The family began moving toward the dining area, where round tables had been set with the kind of elegant place settings that immediately made me conscious of proper etiquette and social expectations. I found myself seated at a table with Amanda, Brian, Sarah, and several other cousins from my generation, along with their spouses and a few family friends who had been included in the reunion festivities. The seating arrangement felt deliberate, grouping the successful professionals together while placing me in the position of having to defend or explain my unconventional career path to an audience that was predisposed to view it skeptically. The conversation during lunch followed predictable patterns, with each person sharing updates about their professional achievements, recent vacations, home improvements, and children's accomplishments. Sarah talked about her medical practice and the research paper she was co-authoring for a pediatric journal. Brian described his recent promotion to senior partner and the complex corporate merger he was handling for a Fortune 500 client. Amanda detailed her work on a high-profile environmental lawsuit that had received coverage in the Chicago Tribune business section. When attention turned to me, I felt the familiar weight of having to justify my choices to people who had already decided that my path was less valuable than theirs. I talked about some of my recent consulting successes, describing how I had helped a local restaurant chain streamline their ordering system and increase their profit margins by 15%. But I could see eyes glazing over as I spoke. The specifics of digital optimization and customer management systems weren't interesting to people who measured success in terms of billable hours, patient loads, and partnership announcements. That sounds very technical and complicated, commented Sarah's husband, who was a radiologist at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Do you enjoy working with all that computer programming and database management? His question revealed a common misunderstanding about consulting work: the assumption that helping businesses with digital systems required extensive technical programming skills rather than strategic thinking and problem-solving abilities. It also suggested that he viewed my work as primarily technical implementation rather than business strategy, which relegated it to a lower level of professional prestige. It's actually more about understanding business processes and finding ways to make them more efficient, I explained, trying to elevate the perception of my work without being too obvious about it. The technology is just a tool for solving fundamental business problems like customer retention, operational efficiency, and revenue optimization. Amanda leaned forward with renewed interest, though I wasn't sure whether it was genuine curiosity or preparation for another subtle put-down. Revenue optimization sounds very sophisticated. What kind of results are you typically able to achieve for your clients? The question felt like a trap, because any specific numbers I mentioned would either sound unimpressive compared to the scale of work that lawyers and doctors dealt with, or would sound like exaggeration that they could challenge. I decided to focus on percentages rather than dollar amounts, which would sound more professional and be harder to evaluate critically. Results vary depending on the business and their specific challenges, I said carefully, but most clients see significant improvements in efficiency and customer satisfaction within the first 6 months. Revenue increases typically range from 15 to 40%, depending on their starting point and how fully they implement the recommended changes. 40% revenue increase sounds amazing, said Jennifer, Brian's wife, though her tone suggested she was being polite rather than genuinely impressed. Of course, that's probably easier to achieve with very small businesses where even modest changes can have a big percentage impact. Her observation was technically accurate but completely missed the point of what I did for my clients. She was suggesting that my successes were somehow less meaningful because they involved smaller absolute numbers, as if helping a family restaurant increase their annual revenue from $200,000 to $280,000 was less valuable than helping a corporation save millions through some legal maneuvering. The percentage improvement is what matters to the business owners, I replied, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. A 40% revenue increase means they can hire additional employees, provide better benefits, invest in equipment upgrades, or expand to new locations. The impact on their lives and their communities is very real, regardless of the absolute dollar amounts involved. Amanda smiled in a way that suggested she found my defensiveness amusing rather than convincing. Of course, Jessica. I didn't mean to minimize the importance of your work. It's wonderful that you found something you're passionate about, even if it's not particularly scalable. The word scalable was chosen with surgical precision to highlight what Amanda saw as the fundamental limitation of my business model. In her world, valuable work could be scaled up to handle larger clients, bigger cases, more prestigious engagements. My focus on small businesses suggested that I was trapped in a niche that couldn't grow beyond a certain point, limited by the size and scope of my target market. Actually, small business consulting is extremely scalable, I said, perhaps more sharply than was appropriate for a family lunch. There are millions of small businesses in the United States, and most of them need help with digital transformation. The challenge isn't finding clients, it's building systems to serve them efficiently without compromising quality. Brian raised an eyebrow at my tone, clearly noting that I was becoming defensive about my career choices. That's an interesting perspective, Jessica. Have you considered transitioning to larger corporate clients as you gain more experience? That's typically how consulting careers develop, moving upmarket to more sophisticated engagements. His suggestion contained the implicit assumption that my current work was essentially entry-level consulting, appropriate for someone building experience, but not suitable as a long-term career focus. He was offering advice about how to develop a real consulting practice that would serve Fortune 500 companies rather than family-owned restaurants and boutique shops. I prefer working with small and medium-sized businesses, I said firmly. Large corporations have plenty of consulting options available to them. Small businesses are often overlooked by the major firms, but they're the backbone of the economy, and they deserve access to high-quality strategic advice. Amanda's expression shifted slightly, and I realized I had made a tactical error. By positioning myself as an advocate for underserved businesses, I had inadvertently reinforced her perception of my work as charity-motivated, rather than profit-driven. In her competitive worldview, choosing to help the overlooked and underserved suggested either inability to compete at higher levels or misguided altruism that would limit long-term success. "That's very noble of you," she said with a smile that didn't hide her condescension. "It's admirable when people choose to help those who can't afford premium services, like legal aid work, but for business consulting." The comparison to legal aid work was devastating in its accuracy and implications. Legal aid was important, socially valuable work that helped people who couldn't afford private attorneys, but it was also poorly paid, resource-constrained, and viewed as a stepping stone or side project rather than a prestigious career path. By comparing my consulting practice to legal aid, Amanda had effectively classified my work as charity rather than business. The conversation continued to spiral downward as dessert was served, each exchange feeling more loaded with judgment and barely concealed criticism. I found myself caught in a familiar trap, trying to defend choices that I knew were right for me while surrounded by people who measured worth through completely different metrics. The chocolate mousse sat untouched on my plate as I struggled to maintain composure in the face of increasingly pointed observations about my life. "You know what I find fascinating about your situation, Jessica?" Amanda said, dabbing her lips with the linen napkin before leaning back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone about to make an important point. "You've managed to create this whole narrative around helping small businesses, but I wonder if you've really considered the long-term implications of your choices." The word narrative was particularly cutting, suggesting that my explanation of my work was essentially a story I told myself rather than an accurate description of professional reality. It implied that I was deluding myself about the value and importance of what I did, constructing elaborate justifications for what was fundamentally a series of poor career decisions. "What do you mean by long-term implications?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this conversation was heading. Amanda had a talent for asking questions that sounded reasonable on the surface but were designed to expose what she perceived as fundamental flaws in other people's thinking. "Well, let's be practical about this," she said, her voice taking on the patient tone that successful people used when explaining obvious truths to those who hadn't figured them out yet. "You're 32 years old, which means you have maybe 30 years left in your working career. You're spending those years building expertise in a very narrow niche that serves clients with limited budgets and growth potential." She paused to take a sip of wine, letting her words sink in while maintaining eye contact that suggested she was delivering tough love rather than cruel criticism. The rest of the table had fallen silent, everyone focusing on their desserts while obviously listening to every word of this increasingly uncomfortable exchange. Meanwhile, people our age who chose more traditional paths are building equity, both financial and professional. Brian's partnership gives him ownership stake in a growing firm. Sarah's medical practice will provide steady income and retirement benefits for decades. My law career has already generated enough assets for David and me to consider early retirement, if we choose. Amanda's analysis was delivered with the kind of clinical precision that made it difficult to argue against without sounding defensive or unrealistic. She was presenting facts about career trajectories and financial accumulation that were undeniably true, at least on the surface. People who followed conventional professional paths did tend to build more visible wealth and security over time. "But here you are," she continued, starting over every few months with new small business clients who may or may not be able to pay consistently, building expertise that large companies don't value, and creating no sustainable equity or long-term security for yourself. The observation stung because it contained enough truth to be convincing while completely misrepresenting the nature of my work and its potential. It was true that I worked with smaller clients and that my income was more variable than a traditional salary. It was also true that I hadn't accumulated the visible markers of wealth that my cousins displayed so effortlessly. "I think you're oversimplifying the consulting market," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing frustration I felt at having to justify my career to people who didn't understand it. Small business consulting is actually a rapidly growing field, and the skills I'm developing are increasingly valuable as more companies go through digital transformation. Brian nodded thoughtfully, but in a way that suggested he was humoring me rather than taking my analysis seriously. "That may be true in general, Jessica, but the question is whether you're positioning yourself to capitalize on that growth. Are you building the kind of reputation and client relationships that will allow you to scale your practice significantly?" His question revealed another layer of family assumptions about my work. They saw consulting as a stepping stone to something bigger and more important, rather than as a valuable profession in its own right. In their minds, successful consultants eventually became executives at major corporations or started their own large companies. My focus on remaining independent and serving smaller clients suggested that I either lacked the ambition or ability to grow beyond my current level. "Actually, I've been thinking about expanding my practice," I said, which was partially true, though not in the way they would interpret it. "There's definitely demand for more comprehensive business development services, not just digital consulting." Sarah perked up at this, apparently relieved to hear that I might be considering a more conventional growth trajectory. "That sounds promising, Jessica. Are you thinking about joining an established consulting firm or trying to build your own larger practice?" The question forced me to confront the gap between my actual plans and what my family would consider appropriate ambitions. I had been thinking about expansion, but not in terms of building a larger firm or joining a corporate consulting practice. Instead, I was considering ways to serve my existing clients more comprehensively, while maintaining the personal relationships and flexible approach that made my work satisfying. "I'm exploring different options," I said vaguely, not wanting to get into specifics that would only reinforce their perception of my work as small-scale and limiting. "The important thing is finding the right balance between growth and maintaining quality relationships with clients." Amanda's smile became more pronounced, as if I had just proven a point she'd been trying to make. "Quality relationships are wonderful, Jessica, but at some point you have to ask yourself whether you're prioritizing comfort over achievement. It's very easy to stay in your comfort zone working with small businesses that don't challenge you professionally." The suggestion that I was avoiding challenge or taking the easy path was particularly infuriating because it revealed how little Amanda understood about the complexity of what I did. Working with small businesses required incredible versatility and problem-solving skills. Unlike consultants who specialized in narrow areas within large corporations, I had to understand every aspect of business operations and be able to provide strategic guidance across multiple functional areas. Small businesses actually present more complex challenges than larger corporations in many ways, I said, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to remain calm. Large companies have specialized departments and extensive resources for implementing changes. Small businesses need consultants who can work across all functional areas and find solutions that work within severe resource constraints. "That's an interesting perspective," said Dr. Patterson, Sarah's husband, though his tone suggested he found it more amusing than convincing. "But surely the complexity you're describing is a function of limitation rather than sophistication. Large companies have specialized departments because specialization is more efficient and effective." His observation cut to the heart of what my family couldn't understand about my career choice. They saw my need to work across multiple business functions as evidence that my clients couldn't afford proper specialized expertise, rather than recognizing it as a valuable skill set that required broad knowledge and strategic thinking ability. Specialization is valuable in large organizations, I agreed. But small businesses need generalists who can see the big picture and understand how different parts of the operation interact with each other. That kind of systems thinking is actually quite sophisticated. Jennifer, Brian's wife, leaned forward with the expression of someone who was about to offer helpful advice to a confused younger relative. Have you considered that maybe you're rationalizing a situation that isn't optimal for your long-term career development? Sometimes we tell ourselves stories about why our limitations are actually advantages. The comment was devastating in its psychological accuracy. She was suggesting that my entire professional identity was built on elaborate self-deception, that I had convinced myself that working with smaller clients was a strategic choice rather than simply the best option, available to someone with limited qualifications and connections. I'm not rationalizing anything, I said, feeling my composure beginning to crack under the sustained assault on my choices and accomplishments. I've built a successful consulting practice that serves clients who need my expertise. The fact that those clients are smaller companies doesn't make the work less valuable or less challenging. Of course not, Amanda said in the soothing tone that people used when they wanted to de-escalate a situation without actually conceding any points. No one is saying your work isn't valuable, Jessica. We're just concerned about whether you're setting yourself up for long-term success and security. The word concerned was perfectly chosen to make me appear unreasonable if I objected to their analysis, while simultaneously reinforcing their position as the successful family members who had earned the right to judge my choices. They weren't being cruel or dismissive, they were being worried relatives who wanted what was best for me. I appreciate the concern, I said through gritted teeth, but I'm confident in the path I've chosen. My work is meaningful, profitable, and aligned with my values. Not everyone needs to follow the same template for success. The reference to values seemed to strike Amanda as particularly naive, judging by the slight eye roll she attempted to conceal. In her worldview, values were a luxury that people could afford to consider after they had achieved financial security and professional status. Prioritizing values over conventional success metrics was something that idealistic young people did, before reality forced them to make more practical choices. Values are important, she agreed. But so is financial security. You can't eat meaningful work or pay your mortgage with alignment to your values. At some point, practical considerations have to take priority. The conversation had shifted from subtle undermining to direct challenge, and I realized that Amanda was no longer pretending to be supportive or concerned. She was making a clear argument that my approach to career and life was fundamentally flawed, that I was prioritizing abstract concepts over practical necessities that every responsible adult should consider paramount. I'm financially secure, I said firmly, though I knew that my definition of security didn't match theirs. My consulting practice generates enough income to support my lifestyle and save for the future. I don't need a corporate salary or traditional benefits to live comfortably. But what about major life expenses? Brian interjected, apparently feeling that someone needed to press the practical argument more forcefully. What happens when you want to buy a house, start a family, or deal with a major health crisis? Freelance income isn't stable enough to handle those kinds of financial commitments. His questions touched on fears that I had wrestled with privately, but had never been forced to defend publicly. It was true that my income was more variable than a traditional salary, and it was also true that I hadn't yet accumulated the kind of savings that would allow me to make major purchases or weather extended periods without work. Freelance consulting actually provides more financial flexibility than traditional employment in many ways, I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt about this argument. If I need to increase my income, I can take on additional clients or raise my rates. Employees are limited by their salary and have to wait for promotions or job changes to significantly increase their earning potential. Sarah shook her head with the patient expression of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child. That's only true if there's unlimited demand for your services, Jessica. And if you can maintain your health and energy indefinitely. happens if you get sick and can't work for several months? What happens if the economy changes and small businesses stop hiring consultants? Her questions highlighted the fundamental insecurity that underlied any independent consulting practice. The reality that my income depended entirely on my personal ability to attract and serve clients. Unlike my cousins, who had built careers within established institutions that provided security and benefits, I had chosen a path that offered freedom and flexibility at the cost of traditional safety nets. Those are risks that any entrepreneur accepts, I said, though I could hear the defensiveness in my own voice. Small business owners, doctors in private practice, lawyers at small firms all face similar uncertainties. The difference is that they're building something that belongs to them rather than working to make other people wealthy. Amanda laughed, the sound sharp and genuinely amused in a way that made everyone at the table uncomfortable. Jessica, you're not building a business empire. You're freelancing for small clients who probably can't afford to pay you what you're worth. There's a difference between entrepreneurship and just refusing to get a regular job. The distinction she drew was brutal in its accuracy and implications. She was suggesting that my consulting practice was essentially elaborate unemployment, that I was avoiding traditional employment by creating the illusion of independent business ownership, while actually operating at the margins of the professional economy. I have 20 regular clients who pay me consistently for ongoing consulting services, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. That's not freelancing or avoiding employment. That's running a successful service business. 20 small clients, Amanda repeated, emphasizing the qualifier in a way that highlighted what she saw as the fundamental limitation of my approach. How much can those clients possibly be paying you? Enough to compete with the salaries that people our age should be earning at this point in our careers. The question about money was the nuclear option in family discussions, the topic that everyone thought about but rarely addressed directly. By forcing me to defend my income level, Amanda was making the conversation about concrete financial comparison rather than abstract discussions of career satisfaction or values alignment. I could feel the entire table waiting for my response. Everyone suddenly fascinated by their dessert plates, while obviously listening for any details about my earning potential. This was the moment when I would either have to admit that my income was lower than theirs, or make claims that they could challenge and potentially embarrass me with follow-up questions. My income is competitive with other professionals my age, I said carefully, trying to avoid specifics while defending my financial position. Consulting rates for experienced practitioners are generally higher than traditional salaries when you account for the billable hours and project-based work. Brian raised an eyebrow at this claim, his legal training making him naturally skeptical of arguments that sounded like they were carefully constructed to avoid providing real information. That might be true for senior consultants at major firms, Jessica, but I'm not sure it applies to independent practitioners working with small businesses. His observation was probably accurate, though I wasn't about to admit it in front of family members who were already convinced that my career was a series of poor decisions disguised as principled choices. The truth was that my hourly rates were competitive, but my total annual income was lower than what my cousins earned because I didn't work as many billable hours, and I often provided services at reduced rates for clients who couldn't afford full market pricing. The point isn't just about maximizing income, I said, trying to shift the conversation back to broader principles rather than specific financial comparisons. It's about building a career that allows you to contribute meaningfully while maintaining flexibility and personal satisfaction. Amanda's expression shifted to something that looked almost like pity, as if I had just revealed that I was even more naive and impractical than she had initially thought. Jessica, that's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people stuck in unsatisfying situations. You're prioritizing abstract benefits like meaningful contribution over concrete advantages like financial security and professional advancement. She leaned forward, her voice taking on the urgent tone of someone delivering an important intervention. Look around this table. Look at this room. Everyone here has made choices that prioritized practical success over idealistic satisfaction. And as a result, we have the resources and status to actually make a difference in the world. The argument was seductive in its logic and difficult to refute without sounding defensive or unrealistic. My cousins had indeed achieved impressive financial success and social status, and their resources did provide them with opportunities to contribute to charitable causes and community organizations in ways that required significant monetary investment. Success means different things to different people, I replied, though I could hear how weak and cliched that sounded in response to Amanda's concrete observations about wealth and influence. I'd rather help 20 small businesses thrive than make a fortune helping corporations maximize profits at the expense of their employees or communities. The reference to corporate exploitation was a mistake, implying criticism of the work that several family members did, and suggesting that their success came at the expense of other people's welfare. I saw Amanda's eyes narrow slightly as she processed the implicit judgment in my statement. "That's a very romantic way of thinking about business, Jessica," she said, her voice now carrying a harder edge that suggested the conversation was about to escalate beyond polite family disagreement. But it's also incredibly naive. The reason small businesses struggle isn't because they're more ethical than large corporations. It's because they're less efficient, less competitive, and less capable of providing value to customers. Her analysis reflected a worldview that measured worth primarily through market success, assuming that companies that generated more revenue and employed more people were inherently more valuable to society than smaller operations that served narrower markets or prioritized different objectives. Small businesses provide employment, serve local communities, and often offer more personalized service than large corporations, I argued, though I realized I was being drawn into a debate about economic philosophy that wouldn't resolve our personal disagreement about career choices. Some do, Amanda conceded, but most small businesses are inefficient operations that exist because their owners can't compete at higher levels. You're not helping them become more successful, Jessica. You're helping them maintain mediocrity more efficiently. The characterization of my work as enabling mediocrity rather than fostering genuine improvement was particularly cutting because it suggested that my clients' limitations were permanent features rather than temporary challenges that could be overcome with proper support and expertise. "That's not true," I said, my voice rising enough to draw glances from nearby tables. "I've helped clients double their revenue, expand to new markets, and create jobs in their communities. That's not maintaining mediocrity. That's facilitating real growth and success." "For businesses that started with very low baselines," Amanda replied dismissively. "Doubling revenue from $50,000 to $100,000 sounds impressive until you realize that it's still a tiny operation that couldn't support a family or provide meaningful career opportunities for employees." Her point about scale was accurate but missed the significance of growth relative to starting conditions. She was measuring success against absolute standards rather than recognizing the achievement of improvement within resource constraints. A family restaurant that doubled its revenue might still be small compared to a chain operation, but the growth represented meaningful progress for the owners and their employees. "Not every business needs to become a Fortune 500 company to be successful," I said, feeling increasingly frustrated by the narrow definition of achievement that seemed to govern my family's thinking. Success can mean providing good jobs for a few dozen people, serving a local community well, or allowing a family to build wealth over generations. Amanda's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "That's exactly what I mean by rationalization, Jessica. You're defending mediocrity by redefining success to match what your clients can actually achieve, rather than pushing them toward real excellence." The accusation that I was lowering standards rather than helping clients achieve their potential struck at the heart of my professional identity and personal values. I believed deeply that my work helped businesses become more successful on their own terms, rather than forcing them to adopt metrics that didn't align with their goals or capabilities. I'm helping clients achieve their actual goals, rather than imposing external definitions of success that may not fit their situations, I replied, my voice tight with controlled anger. That's not rationalization. That's practical strategic thinking. Their goals are limited by their vision and capabilities. Amanda shot back, any pretense of family politeness now completely abandoned. If you were actually providing valuable strategic guidance, you'd be helping them expand their vision and develop the capabilities to compete at higher levels. The conversation had deteriorated beyond mere disagreement about career paths into fundamental conflict about values, definitions of success, and the purpose of professional work. I realized that no amount of explanation or defense would change Amanda's perspective, because our differences weren't based on misunderstanding, but on completely incompatible worldviews. I think we have very different ideas about what consulting should accomplish, I said, trying to de-escalate the increasingly hostile exchange while maintaining my position. I focus on helping clients achieve sustainable improvement within their existing contexts rather than pushing them toward changes that might not be appropriate for their situations. Amanda's smile returned, but now it carried a cruel edge that made everyone at the table visibly uncomfortable. That's exactly the problem, Jessica. You've settled for helping people make small improvements to fundamentally limited situations, rather than challenging them to transcend those limitations entirely. She paused, clearly preparing to deliver what she considered the decisive blow in our argument. And I think that's because you've done the same thing in your own life. You've convinced yourself that your small-scale consulting practice is meaningful work rather than acknowledging that you're just scared to compete at levels where real success is possible. The personal attack shifted the conversation from professional disagreement to character assassination, suggesting that my career choices reflected personal inadequacy rather than strategic thinking or values alignment. Amanda was arguing that I had chosen to work with small clients because I lacked the confidence or capability to pursue larger opportunities. That's completely unfair, I said, my carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the sustained assault on my choices and character. You don't know anything about my motivations or capabilities. You're making assumptions based on your own narrow definition of what constitutes valuable work. I know that you're 32 years old and still living like a college student, Amanda replied, her voice rising to match mine as the conversation devolved into open conflict. I know that you've spent your adult life avoiding the kinds of commitments and responsibilities that define successful adulthood. The reference to my lifestyle as college-like was designed to highlight all the traditional markers of adult achievement that I lacked: home ownership, marriage, children, stable institutional employment. In Amanda's framework, my independence and flexibility weren't valuable freedoms but evidence of failure to mature into proper adult responsibilities. I've built a successful consulting practice that serves clients who value my expertise, I said, my voice shaking with anger and frustration at being forced to defend my entire life philosophy to people who were determined to find it inadequate. I provide meaningful value to businesses and business owners who need strategic guidance. That's not avoiding responsibility. That's taking responsibility for creating something valuable. Amanda leaned back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully provoked the reaction she wanted. Jessica, you can tell yourself whatever stories make you feel better about your choices, but the truth is obvious to everyone at this table. She gestured around the group of family members who had been watching our argument with growing discomfort, though none of them had intervened to defend me or challenge her increasingly personal attacks. You're still the same pathetic failure you've always been, she said, her voice carrying across the dining room with devastating clarity. You've had every opportunity that our family could provide, and you've wasted all of it on this fantasy about helping small businesses while refusing to grow up and build a real career. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, creating a silence so complete that I could hear the soft classical music playing from speakers throughout the dining room. Every person at our table stared at their plates, avoiding eye contact, while obviously absorbing every detail of Amanda's brutal assessment of my life and choices. "You're pathetic," she continued, apparently feeling that her point needed additional emphasis. "At some point, you have to stop making excuses and accept that some people just aren't meant for real success." The attack was so comprehensive and personally devastating that I sat frozen, unable to formulate any response that wouldn't sound defensive or provide Amanda with additional ammunition for further humiliation. She had systematically dismantled every aspect of my professional identity and personal choices, reducing my entire adult life to a series of failures disguised as principled decisions. The worst part was the silence from everyone else at the table, family members who could have challenged Amanda's cruelty, but chose instead to avoid confrontation by pretending not to notice what was happening. Their passive complicity felt almost as devastating as Amanda's direct attack, confirming that her assessment represented the family consensus rather than just one person's harsh opinion. I sat in the deafening silence that followed Amanda's attack, feeling as though the air had been sucked out of the elegant dining room. The classical music continued playing softly from hidden speakers, a mockingly pleasant soundtrack to the most humiliating moment of my adult life. Around our table, family members studied their dessert plates with the intense concentration of people desperately trying to avoid acknowledging what had just occurred. My mother's face had gone pale, her hands twisted together in her lap as she stared at the untouched chocolate mousse in front of her. Dad cleared his throat once, a sound that suggested he might be preparing to say something in my defense. But then he too looked down at his plate and remained silent. Uncle Mike shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Aunt Carol suddenly became fascinated by adjusting her bracelet. The silence stretched on, becoming more damaging with each passing second. If someone had immediately challenged Amanda's cruelty, her words might have been dismissed as an inappropriate outburst. But the longer everyone sat without responding, the more her assessment seemed to gain weight and credibility. Their silence was transforming her personal attack into family consensus. I could feel heat rising in my cheeks, a combination of humiliation and rage that made my hands tremble slightly as I gripped my napkin. Part of me wanted to launch into a detailed defense of my choices and accomplishments, to force my family to acknowledge the value of what I had built. Another part wanted to match Amanda's cruelty with equally devastating observations about her privileged path and superficial achievements. But as I looked around the table at these people who shared my DNA but clearly not my values, I realized that no response would change anything. They had already decided who I was and what my life meant. Any defense would only provide Amanda with additional opportunities to demolish my arguments and reinforce her position as the successful family member delivering tough truths to the relative who refused to accept reality. Instead of speaking, I carefully placed my napkin beside my plate and pushed back my chair. The scraping sound against the hardwood floor seemed unnaturally loud in the continued silence, drawing everyone's attention back to me. For a moment, I met Amanda's gaze directly, seeing the satisfied gleam in her eyes that suggested she was already savoring her victory. "You're absolutely right, Amanda," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil churning inside me. "I am different from everyone at this table. I choose to measure success by the positive impact I have on other people's lives rather than by accumulated possessions or social status." Amanda's expression shifted slightly, as if she sensed that my response wasn't following the script she had expected. I could see her preparing a comeback, ready to interpret whatever I said as further evidence of my delusion or defensiveness. "I help people build businesses that support their families and contribute to their communities," I continued, standing slowly while maintaining eye contact with her. "I've never sued anyone for profit, never foreclosed on a family's home, never made money by exploiting other people's desperation or inexperience." The references to legal practices that generated wealth through other people's misfortune were deliberately pointed, though I kept my tone measured and factual rather than accusatory. I wasn't trying to attack Amanda's profession, but I was, drawing a clear distinction between our approaches to generating income and defining professional value. "If choosing meaningful work over maximum profit makes me pathetic in your eyes," I said, gathering my purse while continuing to speak in the same calm tone, then I can accept that judgment. It tells me more about your values than mine. I could see confusion flickering across several faces around the table as family members tried to process whether I was capitulating to Amanda's assessment or somehow challenging it. My response wasn't fitting neatly into either category, which seemed to be creating uncertainty about how to interpret what was happening. "Thank you all for making your perspective on my life choices so clear," I added, looking around the table to include everyone who had sat silently while Amanda systematically demolished my dignity. "It's information I needed to have." The phrase, "information I needed to have," was chosen deliberately to suggest that their judgment was useful data rather than devastating criticism. By framing their disapproval as helpful feedback rather than personal attack, I was subtly repositioning myself from victim to someone who had gained valuable insight about relationships and priorities. Without waiting for responses or explanations, I turned and walked away from the table, moving through the dining room with deliberate composure despite the emotional chaos I felt inside. I could sense eyes following my movement, hear the rustle of whispered conversations beginning as soon as I was far enough away to provide the illusion of privacy. The walk through Oakwood Country Club's elegant hallways felt surreal, as if I were moving through a movie set designed to represent a world I had never really belonged to anyway. The oil paintings of distinguished members, the gleaming brass fixtures, the thick carpeting that muffled footsteps, all of it suddenly seemed like elaborate stage dressing for a performance I was no longer willing to continue. I retrieved my keys from the coat check and stepped outside into the afternoon sunshine, breathing deeply for what felt like the first time in hours. The parking lot stretched before me, filled with the luxury vehicles that announced their owners' success and status. Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, Audis, Lexuses, and the occasional Porsche or Tesla, all parked in neat rows that reflected the organized affluence of the country club membership. My Honda Civic looked modest and practical among the expensive cars surrounding it, but for the first time in years, I felt no embarrassment about the difference. The car was reliable, fuel-efficient, and perfectly adequate for my needs. The fact that it didn't broadcast wealth or status was irrelevant to its actual function as transportation. Sitting in the driver's seat with the air conditioning running, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had just occurred. Amanda's attack had been brutal and comprehensive, but it had also been clarifying in ways she probably hadn't intended. By forcing me to defend my choices so explicitly, she had helped me understand how much energy I had been wasting trying to earn approval from people whose values I didn't share. The drive back to Chicago gave me time to process the emotional aftermath of the confrontation while navigating the familiar transition from suburban luxury to urban diversity. As the manicured lawns and estate gates of Lake Forest gave way to the mixed-use neighborhoods and busy streets of the city, I felt a corresponding shift in my own perspective on what had happened at the reunion. By the time I reached Lincoln Park, I had moved beyond the immediate hurt and humiliation to something that felt more like liberation. For years, I had been unconsciously constraining my ambitions and limiting my professional growth because part of me feared outshining family members who already viewed me as a threat to their comfortable hierarchy of success. Amanda's public humiliation had destroyed any remaining concern about family approval, but it had also revealed something important about my own relationship with achievement and recognition. I had been holding myself back, not because I lacked ambition or capability, but because I had internalized my family's narrow definition of appropriate success for someone with my background and circumstances. My studio apartment welcomed me, with its familiar combination of organized efficiency and personal touches that reflected my actual preferences rather than social expectations. The workspace I had created around my kitchen table, the client files organized in repurposed storage containers, the whiteboard covered with project timelines and strategic notes, all of it represented genuine accomplishment, even if it didn't fit traditional metrics of professional success. That evening, Instead of dwelling on the humiliation or crafting elaborate comeback speeches I would never deliver, I opened my laptop and began working on a project that I had been postponing for months. Several of my clients had suggested that I develop a more comprehensive business development program, something that would go beyond digital consulting to provide complete strategic planning and implementation support for small and medium-sized enterprises. The idea had seemed too ambitious when I was still concerned about family approval and worried about appearing to reach beyond my appropriate level. But sitting in my apartment with Amanda's words still echoing in my memory, I realized that those concerns had been holding me back from pursuing opportunities that aligned perfectly with my skills and interests. I spent the weekend creating a detailed business plan for what I decided to call Catalyst Strategic Solutions, a consulting firm that would specialize in sustainable growth strategies for businesses that wanted to succeed without compromising their values or community connections. Unlike traditional consulting firms that focused on maximizing short-term profits, Catalyst would emphasize long-term viability, employee satisfaction, and positive community impact. The business model I developed was more ambitious than anything I had previously considered, involving partnerships with other independent consultants who shared my philosophy about sustainable business development. Instead of working alone on small projects, I would build a network of specialists who could provide comprehensive support for companies ready to invest seriously in transformation and growth. Monday morning brought a renewed sense of purpose. As I began reaching out to potential partners and discussing the Catalyst concept with existing clients who might be interested in more extensive consulting relationships. Marcus Chen, a marketing strategist I had worked with on several projects, was immediately enthusiastic about the collaborative approach. Elena Rodriguez, who specialized in financial optimization for small businesses, saw the potential for creating something unique in the Chicago consulting market. The response from my existing clients was even more encouraging than I had anticipated. Rather than viewing expanded services as an expensive add-on, many of them saw Catalyst as an opportunity to access the kind of comprehensive strategic support that had previously been available only to much larger companies with bigger consulting budgets. Rosa Martinez, who owned 3 family restaurants on the South Side, had been struggling with expansion planning and staff development issues that went beyond my usual digital consulting expertise. When I explained the Catalyst approach, she immediately signed up as our first comprehensive client, agreeing to a 6-month engagement that would involve marketing, operations, financial planning, and staff training components. The financial projections for Catalyst were significantly more ambitious than my previous freelance consulting income, but they were also based on providing substantially more value to clients who were ready to invest in serious business development. Instead of charging modest fees for individual projects, we would structure our services around comprehensive transformation programs that justified premium pricing. Within 2 weeks of the reunion, I had signed agreements with 4 consulting partners and secured commitments from 6 clients for Catalyst's launch program. The momentum was building faster than I had expected, driven partly by pent-up demand for the kind of integrated consulting services we planned to provide. The most significant breakthrough came when David Kim, who owned a sustainable packaging company in the suburbs, introduced me to Elena Vasquez, the executive director of the Illinois Small Business Development Center. Elena had been looking for consulting partners who could provide comprehensive support for high-potential small businesses that were ready to scale their operations significantly. The conversation with Elena revealed opportunities I hadn't previously considered. The Small Business Development Center worked with companies that had moved beyond startup phase but needed strategic guidance to achieve substantial growth without losing their foundational values and community connections. These were exactly the kind of clients that Catalyst was designed to serve. Elena offered to pilot a partnership program where the SBDC would refer their most promising clients to Catalyst for comprehensive business development consulting, with partial funding provided through federal small business development grants. The arrangement would give us access to a steady stream of well-qualified clients while providing the SBDC with consulting resources they couldn't offer internally. By the end of March, just 6 weeks after the family reunion, Catalyst Strategic. Solutions had officially launched with a team of 8 consulting specialists, partnership agreements with 3 business development organizations, and a client waiting list that extended into the following quarter. We had moved into a shared office space in River North that provided room for client meetings and collaborative work sessions. The financial transformation was dramatic. My income for the first quarter after launching Catalyst exceeded what I had earned in the entire previous year of independent consulting. More importantly, the work was intellectually challenging and personally satisfying in ways that my previous projects had only hinted at. Instead of helping individual businesses solve isolated problems, we were now facilitating comprehensive transformations that affected every aspect of how companies operated and competed. Rosa's Restaurants had implemented new staff training, programs that reduced turnover by 60%, while increasing customer satisfaction scores dramatically. David's Packaging Company had expanded into 2 new markets, while maintaining their environmental certification and community partnership commitments. The success stories were generating referrals and media attention that positioned Catalyst as an innovative approach to small business consulting. Chicago business publications began featuring our client transformations as examples of how companies could achieve significant growth while maintaining their values and community connections. By late spring, I was being invited to speak at business development conferences and small business association meetings throughout the Midwest. The presentations provided opportunities to share our methodology while building relationships with potential clients and partner organizations that could refer businesses to our services. The personal transformation was equally significant. I had moved from the studio apartment in Lincoln Park to a beautiful 1-bedroom loft in River North, chosen because I loved the space and could easily afford it, rather than because I was trying to impress anyone. The new apartment reflected my actual preferences and lifestyle rather than financial constraints or social expectations. I had also begun traveling more frequently, both for business and personal enjoyment. Consulting engagements took me to Milwaukee, Madison, Indianapolis, and St. Louis, cities where Catalyst was building relationships with business development organizations and potential clients. Personal travel included weekend trips to places I had always wanted to visit but had postponed while focused on building my initial consulting practice. The anxiety that had plagued me throughout my 20s and early 30s virtually disappeared once I stopped trying to meet other people's expectations and started focusing on work that aligned with my actual interests and values. The constant worry about whether my choices were appropriate or sustainable was replaced by confidence based on measurable results and genuine satisfaction with what I was building. Most importantly, I had stopped seeking validation from people who didn't understand or appreciate the kind of work I was doing. The family reunion had been painful, but it had also liberated me from caring about approval from relatives whose definition of success was incompatible with my own values and priorities. As summer approached, I realized that I hadn't spoken to any family members since walking out of the Oakwood Country Club dining room 3 months earlier. My parents had called several times, leaving messages that suggested they wanted to repair the relationship without necessarily acknowledging what had gone wrong at the reunion. I had listened to their voicemails but hadn't felt ready to engage in conversations that would likely involve pressure to reconcile with Amanda or pretend that her attack hadn't revealed fundamental differences in how we viewed success and family relationships. The distance from family drama had allowed me to focus entirely on building Catalyst and developing the kind of professional reputation I had always wanted, but hadn't known how to create. Without the constant undercurrent of family judgment and expectations, I was free to pursue opportunities that excited me rather than worrying about whether my choices would meet with approval from people who didn't understand my work. The irony wasn't lost on me that Amanda's attempt to humiliate me into conforming to family expectations had actually provided the catalyst for the most ambitious and successful period of my professional life. By forcing me to choose between family approval and authentic self-expression, she had inadvertently pushed me toward a path that was more aligned with my actual capabilities and interests. As I prepared for a major presentation to the Illinois Department of Commerce about small business development strategies, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed since that devastating afternoon at the country club. The woman who had sat silent while her cousin systematically dismantled her dignity was gone, replaced by someone who had built something genuinely impressive and valuable. The success wasn't just financial, though the income growth had been substantial enough to change my lifestyle significantly. More importantly, I had created work that felt meaningful and sustainable, surrounded myself with colleagues who shared my values, and built a reputation based on actual accomplishments rather than inherited advantages or social connections. By midsummer, Catalyst Strategic Solutions was being recognized as one of Chicago's most innovative small business consulting firms. Our client retention rate was 98%, our average client revenue growth was 130%, and we had a 6-month waiting list for new comprehensive consulting engagements. The media attention had grown beyond local business publications to include features in national small business magazines and invitations to speak at conferences in major cities across the country. The presentations provided opportunities to share our methodology while building relationships that led to consulting opportunities and partnership agreements with business development organizations nationwide. As autumn approached, bringing with it the 3-year anniversary of the Miller family reunion, I began receiving emails and phone calls from relatives who had heard about Catalyst's success through various channels. The business community in WCZ, Chicago was small enough that news of our rapid growth and media recognition had eventually reached people who knew members of my extended family. The outreach from family members was awkward and transparent, clearly motivated by curiosity about my professional success rather than genuine interest in repairing relationships that had been damaged by their silence during Amanda's attack. I responded politely but briefly to their messages, acknowledging their congratulations without inviting deeper conversation or suggesting that we meet in person. The most interesting development was an email from Uncle Mike, whose plumbing supply business was facing competition from large home improvement chains and online retailers. He mentioned that several business associates had recommended Catalyst for companies dealing with market disruption and competitive pressure, and he wondered if we might be able to help his business adapt to changing industry conditions. I referred him to Elena Rodriguez, our financial optimization specialist, rather than taking on the consulting engagement myself. The referral was based on Elena's expertise rather than family relationships, but it felt satisfying to be able to provide professional resources to someone who had previously dismissed my work as unimportant. As October arrived, I received an unexpected phone call that would set in motion the events leading to the most satisfying moment of my professional life. The caller was Margaret Powell, event coordinator for the University Club of Chicago, explaining that they had received my name as a potential keynote speaker for their annual Small Business Leadership Awards dinner. The event was scheduled for November 15th, just 2 weeks before the Miller family reunion that I had been invited to, but hadn't yet decided whether to attend. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me as I accepted the speaking engagement and began preparing a presentation about sustainable business development strategies for the business leaders who would be honored at the dinner. The invitation to keynote such a prestigious event represented recognition from the business community that went far beyond anything my family had achieved in their respective fields. The University Club was one of Chicago's most exclusive venues, and the Small Business Leadership Awards dinner attracted executives, entrepreneurs, and civic leaders from throughout the metropolitan area. As I worked on my presentation throughout October, I found myself thinking about the contrast between the person who had been humiliated at the last family reunion and the professional who was now being invited to address Chicago's business elite about innovation and sustainable growth strategies. The transformation had been complete and irreversible, built on authentic accomplishments rather than inherited advantages or social connections. Whatever happened at the upcoming reunion, I would be attending as someone who had proven Amanda's assessment wrong through measurable achievements that spoke for themselves. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early November, just as I was reviewing final preparations for my keynote address at the University Club's Small Business Leadership Awards dinner. My assistant knocked on my office door with an expression that suggested the conversation she'd just handled was both unexpected and significant. "Jessica, I have Linda Miller on line 3, she said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality she used when dealing with potentially complicated personal calls during business hours. "She says she's your mother, and that it's important." I hadn't spoken to my parents since leaving the reunion 8 months earlier, though they had left several voicemails during that time expressing concern about our relationship and hoping we could find a way to move past what had happened at Oakwood Country Club. Their messages had been loving, but carefully worded to avoid taking sides in the conflict with Amanda or acknowledging the deeper issues that her attack had revealed about family dynamics. "Hi, Mom," I said, accepting the call while mentally preparing for what would likely be an emotionally complex conversation about family relationships and the choices I had made since walking away from the reunion. "Jessica, honey, I'm so glad you picked up," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and nervous energy that suggested she had been debating whether to make this call for some time. "I hope you're doing well. We've been reading about your business success in the papers, and we're so proud of what you've accomplished." The reference to media coverage about Catalyst's growth was interesting, suggesting that my parents had been following my professional development even during our period of estrangement. It also indicated that they understood the significance of what I had built, even if they hadn't known how to address the family conflict that had precipitated my departure from their lives. "Thank you," I replied, maintaining professional composure while trying to gauge the purpose of her call. "Catalyst has exceeded all our initial projections. We're working with some really exciting clients and having significant impact on small business development throughout the region." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Your father and I always knew you were capable of great things, even when we worried about your unconventional path." She paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath before continuing. "Actually, that's part of why I'm calling today." The shift in her tone suggested that this conversation was moving beyond family reconciliation towards something more specific and potentially more complicated. I waited for her to continue, curious about what might have prompted this particular call at this particular time. "Amanda's law firm is having some serious problems," Mom said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering potentially sensitive information. "I don't understand all the details, but apparently they're losing clients and having trouble with their management systems. Amanda mentioned that they need business consulting help." The irony was immediate and satisfying. The same woman who had called me a pathetic failure was now facing professional challenges that required exactly the kind of expertise she had dismissed as unimportant and unsophisticated. The situation presented an opportunity for vindication that felt almost too perfect to be real. "What kind of problems are they experiencing?" I asked, shifting into professional consulting mode despite the personal history underlying this conversation. "Law firms face particular challenges in adapting to contemporary business practices and client expectations. I'm not sure about the specifics," Mom admitted, but Amanda said something about partners leaving and clients switching to other firms. She mentioned that their approach to business development isn't working anymore, and they need someone who understands modern marketing and client relations. The description suggested classic symptoms of institutional obsolescence, the same challenges that many traditional professional service firms faced when market conditions evolved faster than their ability to adapt. Law firms were particularly vulnerable because they often relied on established relationships and referral networks that could become less effective as client expectations changed. "There are consultants who specialize in legal practice management," I noted, maintaining professional objectivity despite the personal satisfaction I felt at this turn of events. "Has she reached out to any of the major firms that work with law practices?" "That's just it," Mom said, her voice taking on a slightly awkward tone that suggested she was approaching the real purpose of her call. Amanda specifically asked, About you. She said she's heard about your consulting work and wondered if you might be available to help them. The request was both professionally flattering and personally satisfying in ways that I had to carefully manage to maintain appropriate boundaries between business and family relationships. Amanda needed my expertise, but any consulting engagement would have to be handled according to professional standards rather than family dynamics. I appreciate the referral, I said carefully, but Catalyst typically works with small and medium-sized businesses rather than established professional service firms. Amanda's firm would probably be better served by consultants who specialize in legal practice management. Mom was quiet for a moment, and I could sense that she was trying to figure out how to navigate between my professional standards and family relationship repair. Would you be willing to at least talk to her about their situation? I think it would mean a lot to her to have your perspective, and it might be a way for you two to work past what happened at the reunion. The suggestion that consulting work could serve as family reconciliation revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both professional boundaries and the depth of the conflict that Amanda's attack had created. I wasn't interested in using business relationships to repair personal damage, and I doubted that Amanda was genuinely interested in my professional expertise rather than simply seeking help from any available source. "I'll consider it," I said, which was truthful though non-committal. "Have Amanda contact my office directly if she wants to discuss potential consulting services. Any engagement would need to go through our standard evaluation and contracting process." After ending the call with my mother, I sat considering the implications of Amanda's apparent business crisis and her request for my assistance. The situation presented an opportunity for professional vindication that was almost too perfectly ironic to resist, but it also raised questions about whether I wanted to become involved with family members who had shown so little support during my own challenging period. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Amanda's request represented exactly the kind of validation I had once desperately wanted from my family. She was acknowledging that my expertise had value and that my unconventional career path had led to capabilities that she now needed. The recognition was both satisfying and meaningless, coming only after external success had made it impossible to ignore my professional accomplishments. 2 days later, Amanda called my office directly, her voice carrying a formality and respect that was completely different from the condescending tone I remembered from family gatherings. The transformation in her demeanor was immediately apparent, reflecting a power dynamic shift that we both understood but didn't need to address explicitly. "Jessica, thank you for taking my call," she began, her tone suggesting genuine gratitude rather than the casual assumption of availability that had characterized our previous interactions. "I'm sure your mother mentioned that Miller & Associates is facing some operational challenges that might benefit from external consulting perspective." The careful language and professional approach indicated that Amanda understood this was a business conversation rather than family reconciliation, which made it easier for me to respond according to standard consulting protocols rather than personal relationship dynamics. "I understand you're experiencing client retention and business development challenges," I replied, maintaining the same professional tone while taking notes about potential scope and complexity. "Can you describe the specific issues you're hoping to address through consulting support?" For the next 20 minutes, Amanda detailed problems that were both more severe and more systemic than my mother's description had suggested. Miller & Associates was hemorrhaging clients, particularly younger business owners who found the firm's traditional approach outdated and unresponsive to contemporary business needs. 3 senior partners had left within the past year, taking major clients with them and leaving significant gaps in expertise and relationship management. More fundamentally, the firm's entire approach to client service was misaligned with current market expectations. They had built their practice around formal, hierarchical relationships that emphasized legal expertise while minimizing client involvement in strategic decision-making. Contemporary clients wanted collaborative partnerships, transparent communication, and lawyers who understood their business objectives rather than simply providing technical legal advice. We're losing clients to firms that offer more integrated business counsel, Amanda admitted, her voice carrying frustration that seemed both professional and personal. Our traditional strengths aren't enough anymore. Clients want lawyers who understand their industries, their competitive challenges, their growth objectives. We've been practicing law without really understanding the businesses we serve. The assessment was surprisingly sophisticated and self-aware, suggesting that Amanda had genuinely recognized the limitations of her firm's approach rather than simply looking for superficial solutions to temporary problems. The kind of transformation she was describing would require fundamental changes to culture, processes, and client relationship management. That type of comprehensive practice transformation is complex and time-intensive, I noted, sketching out potential project scope while considering whether this engagement aligned with Catalyst's capabilities and strategic priorities. Most professional service firms need 6 to 12 months to implement meaningful changes to culture and client service delivery. We understand that this isn't a quick fix, Amanda replied, her tone indicating that she had realistic expectations about the scope and timeline for effective consulting intervention. But we also understand that without significant changes, we're going to continue losing ground to more innovative competitors. The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, covering financial parameters, timeline expectations, and preliminary thoughts about project structure. By the end of our discussion, it was clear that Miller & Associates represented exactly the kind of institutional transformation challenge that Catalyst had been designed to address, despite being a larger and more established organization than our typical clients. I'll need to review your situation more thoroughly before determining whether we can provide the kind of comprehensive support you're describing, I concluded, following standard consulting protocol for complex potential engagements. If you're serious about exploring this possibility, I'll send you our standard information request and preliminary assessment framework. Amanda agreed immediately to provide whatever information we needed for evaluation, her eagerness suggesting that Miller & Associates' problems were more urgent than she had initially indicated. The conversation ended with professional courtesy and mutual understanding that any potential engagement would be handled according to business standards rather than family relationships. Over the following week, Amanda provided comprehensive documentation about Miller & Associates' financial performance, client feedback, competitive analysis, and internal culture assessment. The materials painted a picture of a firm in genuine crisis, facing existential challenges that required immediate and dramatic intervention to avoid continued deterioration. The decline had been gradual but accelerating, masked for several years by the firm's strong reputation and established client relationships. However, as business environments became more complex and competitive, clients began seeking legal counsel that could provide strategic business guidance rather than purely technical legal services. Miller & Associates had failed to evolve their service delivery model, creating opportunities for more adaptive competitors to capture their most valuable clients. After reviewing all the documentation and consulting with my Catalyst partners, I concluded that Miller & Associates represented a legitimate consulting opportunity that aligned with our expertise in organizational transformation and sustainable business development. The fact that Amanda was family added complexity, but didn't change the fundamental assessment that we could provide valuable assistance to a firm facing serious challenges. The consulting proposal I developed outlined a comprehensive transformation program that would restructure Miller & Associates' approach to client service, business development, and internal operations. The scope included cultural change management, client relationship optimization, marketing strategy development, and implementation of systems and processes designed to support more collaborative and business-focused legal practice. The financial terms reflected the complexity and value of the transformation program. Our standard rate for institutional consulting was $500 per hour, with comprehensive engagements typically requiring 600 to 800 hours over 8 to 12 months. The total investment would likely exceed $300,000, representing a significant financial commitment that demonstrated serious intent to change rather than merely attempting cosmetic improvements. When I presented the proposal to Amanda and the Miller & Associates Board of Directors, the reaction was immediate recognition that our approach addressed fundamental issues rather than surface-level problems. Unlike other consultants they had interviewed, we weren't proposing minor adjustments to existing practices, but comprehensive reimagining of how the firm operated and served clients. "This is exactly what we need," Amanda said after reviewing the detailed transformation plan with her partners. "We've been trying to solve 21st century problems with 19th century approaches. Your methodology addresses the cultural and operational changes we need to make to remain competitive." The board approved the engagement unanimously, authorizing full implementation of the Catalyst Transformation Program with timeline and budget parameters that demonstrated genuine commitment to comprehensive change. The contract signing represented both professional validation and personal vindication, as Amanda publicly acknowledged the value of expertise she had once dismissed as irrelevant. The Miller & Associates transformation became one of Catalyst's most visible and successful engagements, generating results that exceeded even our optimistic projections. Within 6 months, client retention had improved dramatically, new business development was accelerating, and the firm's reputation for innovative legal practice was attracting clients who had previously worked with larger corporate firms. More importantly, for the long-term sustainability of the transformation, the cultural changes had taken root throughout the organization. Lawyers were thinking strategically about client business objectives rather than simply providing technical legal advice. Client relationships had become collaborative partnerships based on mutual understanding and shared goals. The firm's marketing emphasized business results and industry expertise rather than legal credentials and institutional prestige. The success of the Miller & Associates engagement generated significant media attention and referral opportunities that positioned Catalyst as a leading consulting firm for professional service organizations facing market disruption. Business. Publications featured our transformation methodology as a model for how traditional firms could adapt to contemporary competitive conditions without abandoning core professional standards. As November 15th approached, bringing with it my keynote address at the University Club's Small Business Leadership Awards dinner, I reflected on the complete reversal of circumstances since the devastating family reunion 8 months earlier. The woman who had been dismissed as a pathetic failure was now being honored as a business leader whose innovative approaches were reshaping how professional service firms operated and competed. The evening of the awards dinner, I arrived at the University Club in a car that would have impressed even Amanda's status-conscious sensibilities. Not because I was trying to make a statement about wealth or success, but because Catalyst's financial growth had reached the point where luxury, transportation was a practical business expense rather than pretentious display. My keynote address focused on sustainable business transformation strategies that honored traditional strengths while adapting to contemporary market realities. The audience of business leaders, entrepreneurs, and civic officials responded enthusiastically to concepts that emphasized long-term value creation over short-term profit maximization. During the networking reception following the dinner, I was approached by representatives from major corporations, small business development organizations, and academic institutions interested in partnership opportunities with Catalyst. The conversations confirmed that our methodology had applicability far beyond the small and medium-sized businesses we had initially focused on serving. The most significant development came when Dr. Margaret Chen, Dean of Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, invited me to discuss developing a case study program around Catalyst's transformation methodology. The opportunity to contribute to business education at one of the country's premier management schools represented recognition that our approaches had academic as well as practical value. As the evening concluded, I realized that the journey from family humiliation to business leadership had been completed not through revenge or vindication, but through authentic commitment to building something valuable. Amanda's attack had been devastating, but it had also been liberating, freeing me from the constraints of seeking approval from people whose values were incompatible with my own. The following morning brought the invitation I had been anticipating, but hadn't yet decided whether to accept. The Miller family reunion was scheduled for the weekend before Thanksgiving, once again at Oakwood Country Club, and the invitation had arrived with a note from my mother expressing hope that I would attend and help repair family relationships that had been strained by the previous year's events. The decision about whether to attend the reunion required careful consideration of multiple factors beyond simple personal satisfaction or vindication. Catalyst had reached a level of success and recognition that made family approval irrelevant, but the opportunity to demonstrate transformation and set appropriate boundaries remained valuable. Ultimately, I decided to attend the reunion, not to prove anything to family members who had failed to support me during my lowest moment, but to model the kind of authentic success that came from building something meaningful rather than simply accumulating wealth and status symbols. The morning of the reunion, I made preparations that reflected my transformed circumstances while maintaining appropriate perspective about the significance of family opinion. My driver, Marcus, arrived precisely on schedule in the silver Rolls Royce that had become my preferred transportation for important business and social occasions. The car represented practical luxury rather than ostentatious display, chosen for comfort, reliability, and the professional image it projected to clients and business associates. The fact that it would make a dramatic impression at a family gathering was secondary to its primary function as appropriate transportation for someone whose business required projecting success and competence. As we approached Oakwood Country Club, I felt none of the anxiety or insecurity that had characterized my arrival at the previous reunion. The woman who had desperately sought family approval was gone, replaced by someone whose worth was established through measurable accomplishments rather than external validation. Marcus opened the door as we pulled up to the country club's entrance, and I stepped out into the afternoon sunshine wearing a tailored suit that projected confidence and success without attempting to intimidate or overwhelm. The outfit was expensive, but understated, chosen to reflect professional accomplishment rather than ostentatious wealth. The parking lot was filled with the same luxury vehicles I remembered from previous reunions, but my arrival in the Rolls Royce created a stir that was immediately apparent. Family members standing near the entrance turned to stare, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition to something that looked distinctly like awe. Amanda stood frozen near the registration table, her face displaying the kind of shock that comes from having fundamental assumptions challenged by undeniable evidence. The cousin who had dismissed me as a pathetic failure was confronting the reality that I had built something far more impressive than anything she had achieved through her conventional path to success. "Jessica," she called out, her voice carrying across the entrance area with an urgency that suggested she understood the significance of this moment for our family dynamics. "I had no idea you were doing so well." The comment revealed everything about how she had continued to think about me during the months since our consulting engagement had transformed her firm and elevated my professional reputation. Despite working closely with Catalyst and experiencing firsthand the sophistication of our methodology, she had somehow maintained the assumption that my success was limited and temporary. "The consulting business has been very rewarding," I replied, maintaining the same professional demeanor that had characterized our business relationship while acknowledging the family context that added complexity to our interaction. As I walked toward the country club entrance, family members gathered around with expressions that ranged from admiration to confusion to something that looked suspiciously like fear. They were processing the complete reversal of circumstances that my arrival represented, trying to reconcile their previous assessment of my worth with the undeniable evidence of transformation and success. The reunion that followed was unlike any family gathering I had ever experienced. Instead of being interrogated about my choices and accomplishments, I found myself in the position of having family members seek my advice about their own career, challenges, and business decisions. The dynamic had shifted completely, transforming me from the family disappointment into someone whose expertise and judgment were suddenly valued and respected. Uncle Mike approached me during cocktail hour. With the kind of deference he had once reserved for successful business associates rather than family members, he considered underachievers. "Jessica, I've been hearing incredible things about your consulting firm. Elena Rodriguez has been working with my business, and the results have been remarkable. I owe you a debt of gratitude for that referral." The acknowledgement represented more than professional recognition. It was admission that he had been wrong about the value and sophistication of my work. The plumbing supply business that Elena had helped him transform was now thriving, despite increased competition from large retailers and online vendors. Throughout the evening, similar conversations occurred with family members who had previously dismissed my choices, but were now seeking to understand and benefit from the expertise I had developed. The transformation wasn't just professional, but personal, as relationships that had been defined by judgment and condescension evolved into something approaching mutual respect. As the reunion concluded, and Marcus prepared to drive me back to the city, I reflected on the complete journey from humiliation to vindication that the past year had represented. Amanda's attack had been devastating, but it had also been transformative, forcing me to choose between seeking approval and building authentic success. The choice had led to everything I had accomplished since. The launch of Catalyst Strategic Solutions, the partnerships with business development organizations, the media recognition, the speaking engagements, and ultimately, the professional reputation that had commanded respect, even from family members who had once considered me a failure. Sitting in the Rolls Royce as Chicago's skyline came into view, I understood that the real victory wasn't the car or the business success, or even the family's changed attitude toward my accomplishments. The real victory was the complete liberation, from needing their approval or validation to feel secure in my own worth and choices. Amanda's cruelty had been intended to diminish me, but it had ultimately freed me to become everything I was capable of being. Sometimes the most devastating attacks become the greatest gifts, not because they don't hurt, but because they force you to find strength you didn't know you possessed and build something more authentic than anything you could have created while seeking others' approval. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.